Okay, so we'll return to the tool once more before we finish. So what I plan to do in this part of the final session is I want to present some more of the information from lawyers and our solicitors and barristers about what they said about what it's like to be part of childcare proceedings. I want to talk to you about what burnout stress, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress means. I want to talk to you about developing resilience. So what does the evidence say works? And then I conclude with maybe a cautionary tale. And then we'll do an evaluation. So in the survey, we asked solicitors and barristers, how has participating in child protection cases or childcare proceedings affected your health, welfare, sense of well-being? And these are some of the things they talked about. They talked about, you can see the words that are of interest highlighted, being stress. Cases can play in your mind. They can be potentially harmful, being sad and traumatic, distressing. They talked about cases sometimes be very draining and sometimes disheartening. People sometimes saying they feel badly after these cases, would be overly negative and critical generally after a case. It definitely stays with you and sometimes can feel frustrating. You may feel responsible if you're not in a position to advocate effectively. One barrister talked about being very stressful on their mental health. Some other things people said, they talked about responsibility and they talked about being a parent. And what's interesting about the self-care theme for both social workers, psychologists, practitioners, and so on, is there are certain items at certain times that push your button most. So in this case, you see a person talking about their parent, being a parent, and imagining being a parent. So I was talking to a practitioner last month who was saying that they can't work with children under 5 at the moment because their own child is that age, and they find it just too distressing. And this is in the area of domestic abuse. But we also found some solicitors who talked about, being positive. Some of you mentioned it this morning, that it doesn't impact on them much. Or solicitors talk about getting used to it. Or at this stage, in other words, as time goes on in terms of developing their professional confidence, that they get quite good at managing the stress and trying to process some of the traumatic information. And that can happen over time. And that's interesting because the research is very clear that one can develop one's resilience. Some people say that, I'm not that resilient, and my colleague, 2 cases, 2 similar types of situation, one person is very distressed by it and another person is not. What's the difference? What happened? So they also say they talked about occasionally it can be upsetting and distressing, about it taking an emotional toll, and working on childcare cases is stressful, draining, very hard to juggle. This is interesting data because we've never had data like this before from legal practitioners talking about what it's like to be in these cases. We focused on the legal practitioners because there's lots of data about social workers, which we'll come to in a moment. So why are some jobs stressful? The guy who was selling the bike, I'm going to speak on his behalf, it didn't seem like the most stressful job in the world. It seemed quite good. Those of you who work in childcare proceedings might think that in terms of jobs, it's up there, and we know from the international literature, being involved in child protection cases, it's the top 10, top 20. Not as hard as these guys. Maybe their job is had more stressful than yours. They have a very toxic boss. The real guys who play these actors, they don't get much recognition. They don't get any lines. Nobody knows who they are. So in terms of recognition for their job, and that's interesting because having a toxic boss, particularly something about your environment, about coping mechanisms. These are these bubbles. They're very therapeutic to press them. Kids love them. I like them. So what makes certain jobs stressful? So I think what's interesting about child protection and welfare cases is being so close to trauma, being so close to individuals under distress, being so close to threats. I was talking to a solicitor recently who was saying a client turned up at their house and threatened them. Which is upsetting for them. It's also upsetting for their family. What is it about these cases? There is the overlap with your own biography. What I mean by overlap by your own biography is if you experience domestic abuse, both or as an adult or as a child, and you witnessed it with your parents, then domestic abuse cases can be difficult for you. If you are struggling with substance use and there's a substance use issue in a case, or your partner is struggling with that issue, then it can be difficult to be involved in some of these cases. And also the stories are hard to hear. For social workers, there is the challenges of dealing with disguised compliance. There is the challenges of not liking the people that you work with, and that's not just your colleagues. I'm talking about, as practitioners, what would you say to a peer if you were saying, I really don't like working with X? We tend not to do that. We tend not to say that. It's not a safe thing to do. You're supposed to be professional, but yet the person reminds you of a family member that annoys you, or reminds you of a partner where there was something very distressing. So there's something particular about this particular area of work. So when we talk about stress is kind of, as a word, it's just a colloquial word that we throw around, but it actually means something very specific. Stress occurs when there's a lack of balance in the demands and constraints placed on a person in relation to their internal and external supports. And that's what we mean about resilience could be developed. There are things you can do to develop your ability to respond to those situations. And think about it in terms of times when things are stressful in work. There are times when you're able to do anything, give a busy person a job and they'll get it done. And then there's times where you think if somebody gives you one more small thing, you'll stop. So and this is about thinking about, well, what are the demands in a job? And sometimes somebody can say, well, X is not working particularly well. They have only 10 cases, and somebody else has 20, and they're perfectly fine. But those 10 cases can be saturated. What saturated means is that they're exceptionally heavy, they're exceptionally emotionally demanding. They require a huge amount of time to process, to figure out what's happening. So again, thinking about it quantitatively is not sufficient. We think about it in terms of supports. So when we think about the word resilience is thrown around a lot as a term. And if you're familiar with this literature, it's one of the top items that's been researched. So the American Psychological Association defined resilience as being the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, such as family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. So resilience comes from a Latin word, which means bouncing back from difficult experiences. So how come some people bounce back quickly and other people find it difficult to bounce back? What is it about them? Is it an innate characteristic? And I think the research is very clear. It's not an innate characteristic. It's something that is learned, but it's also something about your wider both community support network. Research I did with social workers over the last 15 years, if you were to boil it down to one sentence, the thing that helps them to stay in their job and stay well is their wider support network, their peers. And when that's a supportive network, it helps them to be resilient. It helps them to deal with the job. So the term burnout is thrown around also. How are you getting on? I'm burnt out from that and whatever. Where burnout actually means something very specific. In terms of contradicting myself, while it means something specific, it also is, in the literature, means many things to many people. But Maslow is the researcher who probably most kind of has pinned down what burnout meant. And actually, burnout as a concept is exactly the same age as me. It was first identified in the literature in 1974. So Maslow defined burnout as being about emotional exhaustion, a point where there is deep personalization of clients, and a feeling of personal accomplishment. And we use burnout in a very kind of, I'm burnt out. When you meet a colleague who's burnt out, you know exactly what it looks like. They can't get out of bed. They struggle to find energy to do the work. They talk in very negative, cynical, critical ways about people, and they have run out of resources. So Schofield and Trotter Madison said, you may be suffering from burnout when you feel exhausted or unable to pay attention to what somebody is saying. You find yourself reacting more impatiently and intolerantly than you have in the past. Your sleeping and eating habits change, or you experience a new physical symptom, or you find yourself dreading the beginning of the workday and lacking enthusiasm, motivation, or interest. And this is the reason why we're having this conversation, because we're trying to prevent, organizations, disciplines need to prevent this from happening. You hear about workplace bullying, you hear about suicides in the workplace, you hear about people not able to carry on their jobs. What is happening that the conditions are such that this is happening? So these are some of the environmental stresses that are most, in terms of the research, associated with burnout. These are work overload, having lack of control in your work, having insufficient rewards, where there's unfairness in the job, where there's a breakdown of community, or where there's value conflicts. So I suppose the difference between somebody who's fully engaged in their job, which is somebody who's a lot of energy, a lot of involvement, they have a strong feeling of efficacy, or what's known as self-efficacy. They realize that they're doing something in their job and making a contribution. The opposite of that is somebody who's burnt out, where there's exhaustion, cynicism, or the person feels ineffective. So if they are the things that lead to burnout creation, what is it that you can do in terms of prevention? So it's about sustainable workloads, feeling of choice and control, having recognition and reward built into the job, building a sense of community, building a sense of fairness, respect and justice, meaningful, valued work. Now, I had a conversation with somebody this morning, and it arose about where is the intervention focus, what should it be? And the research has found that burnout in an individual is actually more in the organization more than in the individual. So, and that's very clear. They've been researching this now for 44 years. But what's curious is you talk to people who've been burnt out, and I have, and they will personalize it to themselves. It's all about them. It's never about the organization. Where in actual fact, it's more about the organization than the individual. However, Schofield and Trotter Madison said, like in Godot, you shouldn't wait. And what they mean by that is if you wait for your organization to change, you wait for your organization to look after you, you could be waiting a long time. So yes, we need to collectively build, we need to build our own lifeboat for ourselves, which is a bit of what the self-care plan is about. But at the same time, we need to be critical in our disciplines. What messages are being given in university? What messages are being given in induction? What messages are being given in the profession? But at the same time, finding ways to find things that work to build your resilience. So vicarious trauma, what does that mean? It's also sometimes known as secondary traumatic stress. Vicarious trauma refers to the cumulative effect of working with traumatized clients. And it interferes with, and they were talking about therapists, but it's particularly of interest to us also. It interferes with feelings, how we think, our memories, our self-esteem, or our self-safety. And repeatedly being exposed to stories of trauma can begin to alter the worldview of the helper. Vicarious trauma tends to shift the helper's inner thoughts about our cognitions about the world. So if compassion, satisfaction, so if people who do care labor, emotional labor, intense relationship work, which is what you do, you would expect them to receive compassion satisfaction from the job. And compassion satisfaction is a state, compassion fatigue is the opposite of that. It's a state of tension and preoccupation with the traumatized patients by re-experiencing these traumatic events, avoidance, numbing of bearing witness to the suffering of others. And the person experiencing compassion fatigue can have difficulty in renewing, re-energizing in the cycle of caring. Now, what's interesting about the cycle of caring, it's a model used by Schofield and Trotter Madison. And it says when we work with a client or we work with a service user or we work with a family, what we do is we attach with them. We begin the process. We have an involvement phase. And there is a period where we feel something in relation to the separation. And then we need to recreate or re-energize before we go back into the cycle. Now think about the people who are exposed to trauma repeatedly. Sometimes they have difficulty regenerating. And particularly in terms of when you look at the burnout literature, it talks about people feeling their energy being depleted, their emotional resources being depleted. So for you to provide a good service or for a judge to provide a good decision, we're hoping that they're able to re-energize and go back into the cycle. So Schofield and Trotter Madison talked about in helping, teaching and healing fields, we're essentially we're very highly skilled relationship builders. This is what we do. And you heard Carly talking about that earlier in terms of young children. We do it with parents, we do it with wider families and wider communities. And when we attach, we become involved and we separate and we step away, then we need to do it again. So what is it that you do to replenish your energy? How do you reinvigorate? How do you keep that vitality? So it was amazing this morning to hear some of you saying, I do very well in the job and I don't notice it depleting me. And that's fantastic. The curiosity is, how did you manage that? What are you doing? How do you keep that up? And then how can you teach others to do it? And if you're fine, then, but you notice somebody else is not fine, how can you support them when that happens? So why do some people not seek help? So dealing with trauma, abuse, threats, poverty, deception, fear, negative client feelings, conflict, public and regulatory body scrutiny, disguised compliance, overwork, repeatedly can affect the cycle of caring. So some people are unaware of the impact on their work, of the work on their body and mental health. Some professionals don't wish to acknowledge their fears and feelings. Internalizing the blame, taking responsibility for things that are outside of their control. And if you look at the tool, one of the things we're asking you to do is to identify what is it that you can change and what is it that the organization can do. They do not wish to be seen by colleagues and managers as not coping under duress or not competent. And there's a prevailing coping message from both managers, agency and society is you were trained to do it and you need to do it. And you need to do it at a high standard. Now, this is where I say mea culpa, because when I was a young manager, I'm not sure I was very responsive to this. I'm not sure I supported colleagues and staff well when they were expressing these feelings. So there's something about we need to train managers also and train managing solicitors to create environments where staff members can both say those things, but we can respond to them. So what are the causes of stress and burnout? Well, in the work environment, so these are the themes, we've already mentioned them. So I suppose the question arises, is there anything specific when it comes to child protection and welfare? So child protection and welfare, whether you're a lawyer, solicitor, psychologist, intermediary, the child abuse content in itself can be difficult, or the domestic abuse content, or the content in relation to substance use. Which makes it emotionally demanding labour. Some of this literature talks about the fact that you are containers for the society's anxieties. What they do is they give you their anxieties and they give it to professionals and you maintain it on behalf of the community. And that's emotionally demanding. It's high risk work. What happens if you get it wrong in terms of a child being harmed? In Carly's case example earlier, in terms of a child going back to and being repeatedly abused after that. So the pressure and the responsibility that's experienced by workers is high. There is public scrutiny and criticism if it goes wrong. Generally, this area is under-resourced. Just take the Legal Aid Board, for example. We know, the volume of work that's coming to the Legal Aid Board at the moment is high. We know that referrals from TUSLA are doubling and tripling as the decade goes on. And McFadden, Campbell and Taylor, which is a research group in Queens, looked at secondary traumatic stress in terms of child protection workers. They came up with an amazing finding. And I'll just leave you read that yourself. If there was ever an argument for why it's so important for you, your managers, your family, universities, your employer, society to look after you, it's this finding. It's an amazing finding, isn't it? It's not unexpected, but it's still shocking to see it. In terms of those in law, Peters argues that lawyers who engage empathically and with compassion with people who have experienced trauma are at risk of reversion of what their traumatized clients experience. It comes to follow after what the vicarious trauma literature suggests. So when we think of self-care, resilience, mindfulness, are these buzzwords, or can we really use them as tools for change? So what is it that you can do just to clarify, there's lots of people who do this work and they do it very well and it doesn't impact on them, or doesn't impact them in a way that they can't recover from it. So we need to acknowledge that. So what is it that they're doing to make sure that personal resilience is strong, that their coping mechanisms are effective, that they find peer and supervisory support that is strong, that they can feel a good sense of compassion, satisfaction, or that they engage in mindfulness activities, which I'll define in a moment. And Donald and Jack found that in preventing stress and burnout, finding ways to increase support and finding ways to increase self-efficacy reduces stress, even when job demands are high. Because there's one thing you can't do, is you can't reduce the job demands in child protection. You can't. The cases will keep coming to court, the cases will keep coming in. So you can't change that part of it, but you can change around it. So Schofield and Trotter Madison have a couple of suggestions. They say the best way to sustain the professional self is engage in meaningful work. So what that means is up for you to decide. But that if you find yourself from work that is not meaningful, then maybe you're not in the place that you need to be. You need to look for something else. Maximizing the experiences of professional success. If you're waiting for you to be nominated for Professional of the Year, the best lawyer in Ireland, if you're waiting for the university to come along and hold you up as the best practitioner in the country and possibly in Europe, if you're waiting for those letters and a box of chocolates, they may not come. And if that's your definition of success, then you might be disappointed. And they talk about maximizing your definitions of small successes and owning them and recognizing that you make that contribution. And that's connected to avoiding grandiose impulses and relishing, I made a small difference there, successes, and banking them. Thinking long term, creating and sustaining an active, individually designed developmental method, which is what the Spark tool is about. Professional self-understanding. So for some people, that's a counseling process. Some people, that's a professional supervision process. For some, that's a reflective journaling process to make sense of their professional development. They talk about creating a professional greenhouse at work, and this is where managers come in, service managers, area managers, managing solicitors, creating an environment where practitioner growth is both encouraged. There's self-care and leadership promotes a balance between caring of others and caring for themselves. There's a professional support network developed. I know of a network of lawyers who work individually, but they've decided to create a collective themselves. And that collective, while they're competing solicitor firms, they managed to provide support. Because when she looked at lawyers internationally, some lawyers are particularly at risk because they're solo practitioners. So what does a solo practitioner who needs to debrief, where do they go? Now, legal aid boards, like Catherine, I presume you have a group of people in the office and people can come back and debrief. But think of that solo practitioner who comes back, how did they debrief? And we know that debriefing is a very effective mechanism. I suspect the partners of those have even more debriefing when they come home. But there's only so much debriefing you can do with a partner for confidentiality reasons. Receiving support from mentors, supervisors and bosses, being nurtured from your work as mentors, supervisors and managers, learning how to be professional and playful. Interesting, the word play came up a number of times on the stickies. It was nice to see. Using professional venting and expressive writing. Professional venting is coming back and talking to your colleagues and managers. Being a good enough practitioner. Understanding the reality of pervasive early professional anxiety. That was something somebody mentioned in this part of the room this morning. And particularly in terms of normalizing the anxiety in the first 5 years of practice and holding and containing that anxiety. Increasing cognitive excitement and decreasing boredom by reinventing oneself. Hands up, who's the beekeeper? Come on, who said the beekeeping? Yes. So if you look at one of the things you can do earlier, one of the things you can do is take on something new. Take on that activity, learn a new skill, and that's what that's about. Minimize ambiguous endings. Ambiguous endings is particularly what happens in child protection when things finish. The person doesn't want to see you anymore. They move areas, and there's the cycle of caring doesn't finish. The involvement, the ending phase doesn't happen. So trying to minimize that where possible. And learning to set boundaries, creating limits, and saying no to unreasonable requests. Now, that's a very nice list, but some of it's a bit aspirational. Some of it's not possible in certain jobs. Some of it's not possible at this time, but again, there's good grist and suggestions. So there's no money in that list. Maybe we should pay more. So is paying practitioners better? Is that going to make them happier, more valued? And the Easterling paradox basically says that no, that's not the case. The evidence is very strong and has been strong for about 20 years now. That money is not the answer. So it was hypothesized in capitalist theory that when GDP went up, people's satisfaction would go up. GDP went up and life satisfaction just has stayed in the middle. So some of the suggestions earlier about developing coping mechanisms, so engaged coping mechanisms are like problem solving, seeking social support, expressing emotions, particularly difficult to do in an office where you have to be seen to be coping. You are supposed to control your emotions, you're a professional, the message is really you can't do that here. And I know of a good number of solicitors who were saying that they use counselling to do that. Because they can't do it in their profession. So they pay for it, they buy it in outside. And then disengaged coping mechanisms are things like problem avoidance, not owning the issue, withdrawing socially, having wishful thinking, or being very self-critical of themselves. And again, we know that supervisor and co-worker support is very strong in this area. So this is why people set up professional mentoring groups, they set up peer-to-peer groups, they set up CPD events for peers in their area, and that is supportive. So I'm going to move on a small bit, and we're going to watch a video for a moment. Do we have any mindfulness practitioners in the room? Yeah? Could you explain very quickly what you understand mindfulness to be?
Mindfulness is to bring yourself into the present moment and to be very aware of how you're feeling and sort of physically how you're feeling.
Yeah.
And to be able to pay attention to what's around you.
Yeah.
Because you're not completely sucked into
Yes.
whatever narrative's going on in your head.
Yeah.
You're aware of the person on the chair.
Yeah.
And you see more, you're in the moment.
Yes. So it allows you to take a step back. It allows you to clarify your thinking. It allows you to be more mindful of your body, your breathing, and where you are. And the research on mindfulness is very strong. You know, call it hippy-dippy relaxation or what else the people are very somewhat critical or throw away comments in relation to mindfulness. The evidence is very strong. The evidence is suggesting that it's a very positive intervention, not for everybody, but for some. So if Schofield and Trotter Madison's list is a very useful supportive list, this is something else. So just a very short video by a mindfulness expert to explain what it is and how to do it.
We live in an incredibly busy world. The pace of life is often frantic, our minds are always busy, and we're always doing something. So with that in mind, I'd like you just to take a moment to think, when did you last take any time to do nothing? Just 10 minutes, undisturbed. And when I say nothing, I do mean nothing. So that's no emailing, texting, no internet, no TV, no chatting, no eating, no reading. Not even sitting there reminiscing about the past or planning for the future. Simply doing nothing. I see a lot of very blank faces. My thinking is probably have to go a long way back. And this is an extraordinary thing, right? We're talking about our mind. The mind, our most valuable and precious resource through which we experience every single moment of our life. The mind that we rely upon to be happy, content, emotionally stable as individuals, and at the same time to be kind and thoughtful and considerate in our relationships with others. This is the same mind that we depend upon to be focused, creative, spontaneous, and to perform at our very best in everything that we do. And yet, we don't take any time out to look after it. In fact, we spend more time looking after our cars, our clothes, and our hair than we... Okay, maybe not our hair, but you see where I'm going. The result, of course, is that we get stressed. You know, the mind whizzes away like a washing machine going round and round, lots of difficult, confusing emotions. And we don't really kind of know how to deal with that. And the sad fact is that we are so distracted that we're no longer present in the world in which we live. We miss out on the things that are most important to us. And the crazy thing is that everybody just assumes, well, that's the way life is, so we just kind of got to get on with it. But that's really not how it has to be. So I was about 11 when I went along to my first meditation class. And trust me, it had all the stereotypes that you can imagine, the sitting cross-legged on the floor, the incense, the herbal tea, the vegetarians, the whole deal. But my mum was going and I was intrigued, so I went along with her. I'd also seen a few kung fu movies, and secretly I kind of thought I might be able to learn how to fly, but I was very young at the time, you know. Now, as I was there, you know, I guess like a lot of people, I assumed that it was just an aspirin for the mind. You get stressed, you do some meditation. I hadn't really thought that it could be sort of preventative in nature. Until I was about sort of 20, when a number of things happened in my life in quite quick succession. Really serious things, which just flipped my life upside down. And all of a sudden, I was inundated with thoughts, inundated with difficult emotions that I didn't know how to cope with. Every time I sort of pushed one down, another one would just sort of pop back up again. It was a really very stressful time. I guess we all deal with stress in different ways. Some people will bury themselves in work, grateful for the distraction. Others will turn to their friends, their family, looking for support. Some people hit the bottle, start taking medication. My own way of dealing with it was to become a monk. So I quit my degree, I headed off to the Himalayas, I became a monk, and I started studying meditation. People often ask me, you know, what I learned from that time. Well, obviously it changed things, you know. Let's face it, becoming a celibate monk is going to change a number of things. But it was more than that. You know, it taught me, it gave me a greater appreciation and understanding for the present moment. By that I mean not being lost in thought, not being distracted, not being overwhelmed by difficult emotions, but instead learning how to be in the here and now, how to be mindful, how to be present. I think the present moment is so underrated. It sounds so ordinary, and yet we spend so little time in the present moment that it's anything but ordinary. There was a research paper that came out of Harvard just recently that said on average our minds are lost in thought almost 47% of the time. 47%. At the same time, this sort of constant mind wandering is also a direct cause of unhappiness. Now, we're not here for that long anyway, but to spend almost half of our life lost in thought and potentially quite unhappy, don't know, it kind of seems tragic, actually, especially when there's something we can do about it. When there's a positive, practical, achievable, scientifically proven technique which allows our mind to be more healthy, to be more mindful and less distracted. And the beauty of it is that even though it kind of need only take about 10 minutes a day, it impacts our entire life. But we need to know how to do it. We need an exercise, we need a framework to learn how to be more mindful. That's essentially what meditation is. It's familiarizing ourselves with the present moment. But we also need to know how to approach it in the right way, to get the best from it. And that's what these are for, in case you've been wondering. Because most people assume that meditation is all about sort of stopping thoughts, getting rid of emotions, somehow controlling the mind. But actually it's quite different from that. It's more about sort of stepping back, sort of seeing the thought clearly, witnessing it coming and going, emotions coming and going without judgment, but with a relaxed, focused mind. So for example, right now, if I focus too much on the balls, then there's no way that I can relax and talk to you at the same time. Equally, if I relax too much talking to you, then there's no way I can focus on the balls. I'm going to drop them. Now in life and in meditation, there'll be times when the focus becomes a little bit too intense and life starts to feel a bit like this. It's a very uncomfortable way to live life when we get this tight and stressed. At other times, we might take our foot off the gas a little bit too much and things just become a little bit like this. And of course, in meditation, we can end up falling asleep. So we're looking for a balance of focused relaxation where we can allow thoughts to come and go without all the usual involvement. Now, what usually happens when we're learning to be mindful is that we get distracted by a thought. Let's say this is an anxious thought. So everything's going fine, and then we see the anxious thought, and it's like, oh, didn't realize I was worried about that. You go back to it, repeat it. Oh, I am worried. Oh, I really am worried. Wow, there's so much anxiety. And before we know it, right, we're anxious about feeling anxious. You know, this is crazy. We do this all the time, even on an everyday kind of level. If you think about the last time, I don't know, you had a wobbly tooth. You know it's wobbly, and you know that it hurts. But what do you do every 20, 30 seconds? I don't know. I don't know. It does hurt. And we reinforce the storyline, right? And we just keep telling ourselves. And we do it all the time. And it's only in learning to watch the mind in this way that we can start to let go of those storylines and patterns of mind. But when you sit down and you watch the mind in this way, you might see many different patterns. You might find a mind that's really sort of restless and the whole time. You know, don't be surprised if you feel a bit agitated in your body when you sit down to do nothing and your mind feels like that. You might find a mind that's very sort of dull and boring, and it's just almost mechanical. It just sort of seems to, it's as if you're just sort of getting up, going to work, eat, sleep, get up. Or it might just be that one little nagging thought that just goes round and round and round to your mind. Whatever it is, meditation offers the opportunity, the potential to step back and to get a different perspective, to see that things aren't always as they appear. You know, we can't change every little thing that happens to us in life, but we can change the way that we experience it. That's the potential of meditation, of mindfulness. You don't have to burn any incense, and you definitely don't have to sit on the floor. All you need to do is to take 10 minutes out a day to step back, to familiarize yourself with the present moment so that you get to experience a greater sense of focus, calm, and clarity in your life. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I could have done all that, but I can't, Jogan. If you're interested, there's Elaine's put together a lot of resources for you in terms of mindfulness. There's a lot of apps out there. And again, mindfulness is just one suggestion of something you can do. It helps you develop your resilience. It helps you to address how you feel in your body, and also helps you with your thinking. So what are the other practical suggestions? The literature is very strong on these. Again, you have acceptance, balanced expectations, positive reappraisal, rehearsal, ventilation of feelings, self-detachment. Again, these are not things that you just pick up in a box and, you know, I'm doing it now. This takes practice. This takes training. This takes a supervisor who's able to support you in doing it, a therapeutic process. It takes you involved in reflective writing. This involves you not catastrophizing. It involves you, engaging in processes. So again, like the idea behind the self-care tool, the Spark that we've developed, is not that you fill it out and you walk away and say, I've done it, I'm sorted. They're prompts to get you to think about where is it that you need to go. And maybe out of today, we're asking you to think of what one change could you make that would strengthen your self-care plan out of today. And one of those changes we want you to particularly focus on is sleep. Sleep is for the weak. And the reason why we're focusing on sleep is if you were looking for one thing, if you remembered nothing of what I told you out of today, the research is very, very strong now in psychology, in neuroscience, in terms of the impact of sleep. And the most prominent researcher in this area at the moment is Walker. And I want to show you a very quick video of Walker talking about the impact of sleep.
My name is Matthew Walker. I am a professor of neuroscience and psychology at the University of California, Berkeley, and I am the author of the book, Why We Sleep. We certainly know that a lack of sleep will actually prevent your brain from being able to initially make new memories. So it's almost as though without sleep, the memory inbox of the brain shuts down and you can't commit new experiences to memory. So those new incoming informational emails are just bounced and you end up feeling as though you're amnesic. You can't essentially make and create those new memories. We also know that a lack of sleep will lead to an increased development of a toxic protein in the brain that is called beta amyloid, and that is associated with Alzheimer's disease, because it is during deep sleep at night when a sewage system within the brain actually kicks into high gear and it starts to wash away this toxic protein, beta amyloid. So if you're not getting enough sleep each and every night, more of that Alzheimer's related protein will build up. The more protein that builds up, the greater your risk of going on to develop dementia in later life. What are the effects of sleep deprivation on the body? Well, there are many different effects. Firstly, we know that sleep deprivation affects the reproductive system. We know that men who are sleeping just 5 to 6 hours a night have a level of testosterone which is that of someone 10 years their senior. So a lack of sleep will age you by almost a decade in terms of that aspect of virility and wellness. We also know that a lack of sleep impacts your immune system. So after just one night of 4 to 5 hours of sleep, there is a 70% reduction in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells. And that's the reason that we know that short sleep duration predicts your risk for developing numerous forms of cancer. And that list currently includes cancer of the bowel, cancer of the prostate, as well as cancer of the breast. In fact, the link between a lack of sleep and cancer is now so strong that recently the World Health Organization decided to classify any form of nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen. So in other words, jobs that may induce cancer because of a disruption of your sleep-wake rhythms. We also know that a lack of sleep impacts your cardiovascular system, because it is during deep sleep at night that you receive this most wonderful form of effectively blood pressure medication. Your heart rate drops, your blood pressure goes down. If you're not getting sufficient sleep, you're not getting that reboot of the cardiovascular system. So your blood pressure rises. You have, if you're getting 6 hours of sleep or less, a 200% increased risk of having a fatal heart attack or a stroke in your lifetime. There is a global experiment that is performed on 1.6 billion people twice a year, and it's called daylight savings time. And we know that in the spring, when we lose 1 hour of sleep, we see a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks the following day. Another question perhaps is, what is the recycle rate of a human being? How long can we actually last without sleep before we start to see declines in your brain function or even impairments within your body? And the answer seems to be about 16 hours of wakefulness. Once you get past 16 hours of being awake, that's when we start to see mental deterioration and physiological deterioration in the body. We know that after you've been awake for 19 or 20 hours, your mental capacity is so impaired that you would be as deficient as someone who is legally drunk behind the wheel of a car. So if you were to ask me what is the recycle rate of a human being, it does seem to be about 16 hours, and we need about 8 hours of sleep to repair the damage of wakefulness. Wakefulness essentially is low-level brain damage.
It's cheery, isn't it? It's shocking, isn't it? You know, so if you were, this book was published last year. This is as up to date as you get. You know, so if you were going to make one change, this is the change. But this is the slide I've been waiting to show you. I've been waiting all day. I have a friend called Mossy, and when Mossy and I were young, we used to go out partying. And then when we had children, then we used to go out partying less. And then we had children, and then we might meet in the evening, the odd time for a drink. And then we might meet in the afternoon. And then we started meeting for lunch, and now we can only meet for breakfast. All right, because life is too busy. But what's interesting about Mossy is every time I go away from physically meeting him for food, I always feel better, right? And this research came out last week. And this research, so I asked you to take away two things. The first one is sleep, and the second one is The research is very strong on one of the best things you can do is meet your friends and have food with them. It is top of the tree. So they've done research in a range of countries. And when they looked at it, this is the thing that came up top. So why is it? I mean, what's happening when you meet somebody? Why is it like if you tweet somebody or text them or you are on the phone to them, why do you not get the same bang? What do you think is going on? Or what's going on?
Just a fuller experience or interacting with somebody on a lot of different levels.
Yeah, yeah. Tell me, what are the levels? You can see them.
See them.
Yeah.
There's emotion involved.
Yes.
People are animated in discussions.
Yes.
Conversations.
Yeah.
And I suppose the whole food thing, there's comfort in that.
Yes.
Social aspect.
Yes. What else is it? It's all of that. And we were having very nice eye contact when you were telling me about that. You get no eye.
Senses, your smell.
You're using all the sense, your smells. Yeah. What else? It's fun. What else?
You've got your full attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you sharing. And you both sharing and having the full attention is so important. Having spaces in your life where you lock eyes with somebody. When you lock eyes with somebody and when you're with people you like and they're listening to your story and you're being listened to, you get an opiate hit in your brain. You know, it hits that part of your system. You get a buzz off it. But it's safe, obviously. It's not the dodgy opiate one in the States with the illegal stuff. It's storytelling. It's slowing down. So you get food, you get chemicals, you get friendship, you get listened to, you get what else? You get yes, it's bonding. It's a ritual. So again, think about those times in your life. Remember, he was saying life is very busy. This is the thing that falls away, isn't it? You know, this is the hard part to do. You have to arrange it. You have to get everybody together. At our age, you need lots of babysitters. You know, you need lots of teenagers who are going to facilitate you to get out and so on. However, the hit that you get from it, the impact you get from it is huge. So I'm going to conclude and by asking the question is there a magical formula when it comes to self-care? Well, it does seem to be that sleep is high on the list. Peer support is very high on the list. I haven't mentioned it today, but volunteering is very strong on the literature. A word of caution for you, it should be non-trauma informed volunteering. So if you're working with domestic abuse cases all day, don't be on a helpline at nighttime volunteering. You should do something else. Mindfulness is very strong. Doing a hobby activity, which is why I mentioned the bees. If you have a hobby, what does keeping bees or being involved with bees mean to you? What do you get from it?
I just don't think about anything else, only the bees.
Yeah. And how do you feel when you come away from it?
Relax.
Yeah. Did you have to learn a lot to?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So again, it's that. Did you have a hobby that you did before, but you've left it go? Did you have an activity that you really enjoyed, but you don't do as much of? It's about re-engaging that. Quality time and eating with friends and adaptive coping strategies. However, so I mentioned about food. So Connor and I were chatting at the back, and I want to guarantee you we've developed 2 tools so far. There will be a third one soon. I guarantee you we will not be producing a sex life satisfaction tool. So the same research found that while social eating is at the top of the tree, the top 4 items were a sense of having enough time. And that's, you know, making decisions in your life to strip things away that you have time. Sex life satisfaction was very significant for the participants and sleep quality. But I'm going to finish on a word of caution. So when we talk about self-care and developing resilience, there is a downside to this, and part of it is what's known as responsibilization. And responsibilization in social policy is where governments and organizations like individuals to feel responsible for things that are the collective responsibility or the responsibility of society. So when they tell an individual that you were overweight and it's your fault and you don't go to the gym, you don't eat enough food, it doesn't take into account the impact of living in poverty and the quality of food that's there and how expensive good food is, for example. So part of the issue with self-care is it could feel like you are being made individually responsible for something that's not collectively your responsibility. So while I did mention the metaphor earlier of building your own lifeboat, part of building your own lifeboat is also about us having collective action to try and change our workplaces, change our disciplines, change our training, and also trying to make that positive impact with peers. So the very last thing is, I'm not going to ask you to do it now, but at the back page of your Spark tool, there's a very small space, and maybe on your way home or this evening or tomorrow, you would make a note. What is it that your self-care plan is? If you have one, augment it and make a tiny adjustment. If you don't have one, could you make some notes and then rehearse it and implement it and review it and rehearse it and implement it? Because the Spark tool, the reason why we made it is it's something you need to take away with you and think about. We have a lot of them over here that are blanks if you'd like to take it away for your colleagues. So while you take out your evaluation form now and fill it in for 2 minutes, Connor is just going to say something to conclude. Or Elaine, do you want? Yeah, okay.